Hi, and welcome to Chapter 1 Social Problems. As you're reading your text, you're going to find that there is no universal, absolute definition of what a social problem is. It's what's called socially constructed. Society decides what falls under a social problem, and it can change over time. What is a social condition can turn into a social problem. There needs to be elements for a social problem. The first is the objective element of social conditions. These are social conditions that go on around us all the time, and we become aware of it through our own experiences. You may drunk driving. You may see accidents on the news, or actually know somebody who's been involved in drunk driving. Smoking. You may know people who smoke. Vapes, tobacco, cigarettes. And so these are things that you see, you're aware of. The next is a subjective element of a social condition. These are the elements of a social problem. So it's a belief that a particular social condition harms or causes problems for society or parts of society. People believe that it diminishes the quality of life. Drug addiction, crime, poverty, tobacco, again. And then you have historical times. Now, I said that it's socially constructed. Social problems are socially constructed, and historical times changes that. For example, let's go with a social condition of no seatbelts. Driving. Now, I know this is a very simplistic example. So many of you are at the age where seatbelts has been always there. You don't know any different. Car seats have always been there for children and infants. I like the story that I was told by my parents in the 60s when I was born and I was a baby. There were no car seats or infant seats. And I was in a bassinet, and we were driving up to the mountains, and my father took a curve a little too fast, and the bassinet fell over, and I went out onto the floor, and I was not more than about 3 months. Historically, so that's a condition, that's a social condition. You kind of wonder back then, what were we thinking as a society, this not being invented? But think about the cars, think about the roads. These were small roads, the speed limit was not very high. But things have changed over the years. We now have interstates, highways that you can drive 70 miles per hour. That's the speed limit. And we all know that most people don't drive at 70 miles per hour. Everybody has that idea, or most people have the idea, that I can go 5 to 10 miles over before I get a ticket. Cars are not built with steel like they used to be. Let's go with seatbelts. Also, now in 1972, they did realize that car seats for infants and children was probably a really good idea and an invention, and there was a problem that a lot of babies might be killed or harmed. So in 1972, they did enforce the car seats. Seatbelts is a different thing. Now, you also have people who don't believe that something is a social problem and others do. So you have some conflict there. Seatbelts were in cars, but it was never enforced to wear them. It was a personal choice. It was not enforced until the 1990s. Somebody came along, said this is an issue, and then we will talk about how that came about through research methods near the end of the lecture. But many people disagreed that this was a social problem. Another example is tobacco use. I talked about, North Carolina's income and economics has been based on tobacco since it was founded. Tobacco use was allowed. Everybody smoked, or not everybody, but many people smoked. It was culture. It was something that was accepted. You could smoke at the high school at 16 years old. They had a smoking area. Bowling alleys, restaurants, offices, everywhere. Again, I go back and think, what were we thinking as a society? But that's what we knew. the government then decided that, you know what, there's maybe an issue. This has become a social problem. And so they started enacting where it was 18 to buy tobacco products. You could no longer smoke in bowling alleys, businesses, offices, or pretty much in a public place. History had started to change. If you look at institutions, our society and social problems, we look at the institutions in our society. These are family, government, education, religion, economics, and they are very important. And the media is also a big institution. And they play a huge part in our beliefs, our values, how we are controlled to follow the rules of these beliefs and values and morals, which is called sanctions. And each has a great impact on our daily life. Each of these institutions helps define what might fall under a social problem based on the beliefs, the values of that institution, the family, the government. Let's go back to smoking and tobacco use, especially vaping. Smoking has been looked at, it was approved, it was acceptable, and then it started to change. Recently, now the government has stepped in and put in a federal law that vaping, smoking, tobacco products could not be sold to anybody under the age of 21. Many families believe that this is a social problem with the beliefs. It causes cancer, it's harmful, the government, and there also plays in a money deal. Insurance companies have a big part in this too, because they have to spend money to help people through medical needs that have been smoking. There are research to that. You have a group that are saying, no, we're 18. If you're considering us an adult in all other areas, why are you making us wait to 21? And so they're disagreeing that this is not a social problem, and you're going to have that. Not everybody agrees that a social condition is a social problem. We all have different perspectives, which leads me into the sociological theories and perspectives. Now, for those of you, there are many who have a history. You've taken classes, different sociology classes, and you have been exposed to the sociological imagination and the sociological perspectives. There are many that in the class that have not had a sociology class before, so I definitely want to go over this point, these perspectives. It's very important. The theories and the perspectives are very important because you're going to use them. It's a way of looking at things. C. Wright Mills, who was a sociologist in 1959, coined the term sociological imagination. It's how we look at things based on our life experiences and the world around us. So, for example, if we go into a museum and we go and look at the paintings and it's abstract, one person standing there might look at a building and they first think of a church and say that must be a church. Another person standing there goes, no, that's a building, that must be a prison. Now, there's a bit of an extreme, but it's based on people's experiences and how they are looking at things. The person who says it looks like a prison may have had family members or been in a prison, and that's what it reminded them of. The church, same with the second person, their experiences. So, social imagination is how we look at things, that perspective. In sociology, we have three main perspectives. They're called the structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionalism. When you are looking at social problems, when we're going through this semester, you want to look and become very familiar with the theories and with the sociological perspectives. How are you looking at the social problem? What perspective are you coming from? What values, what beliefs, what experiences? So let's talk the structural functionalism. Structural functionalism. Our society is set up by institutions. I mentioned them earlier. You have family, where you begin your first socializations and your beliefs. Religion, government, education, You spend majority of your time growing up at school. The media, we spend a great deal of time watching media, and it kind of puts out there what they feel is acceptable, what's cool, what's going on, what's new. And so these structures play a huge part. We have to have each one of these structures for our society to function. And so functionalism means that, from that perspective, is we need different roles, we need different social classes, we need different perspectives, we need different structures and institutions to make society stable. Each one plays a part, and they're all kind of equal. We also have to have sanctions, how to have people make sure that they are following the values and the beliefs. We also have to have different power. Now, it may not be fair, it doesn't come out to be equal all the time. We have different social classes, different races, different power, but we have to have this under the functional perspective. It has to be there, or otherwise society would not run and would not remain stable. The second sociological perspective is what's called conflict theory. Conflict theory is based on Karl Marx and socialism. He wrote the Communism Manifesto. And in your book, it talks about Marxism and non-Marxism. Karl Marx was all about money, economics, the people that owned all the industries, owned the money, had the power, and those that did not. And there was always a conflict of the people who have not wanted more and wanted what those that had more. It also talks about the power. So under Marxism, social problems result in class inequality. So let's look at poverty and homelessness. Karl Marx, under Marxism, would look at the money. So our minimum wage is $7.25. If you actually did a budget, which I've done in my intro sociology classes, you can't make a living wage on this. You can't live on this. It's almost impossible, based on the prices of things today. Some companies are at $8 or $10, still not completely a living wage. But then you look at the owners of the company, the CEOs, the investors. They're up in the millions and billions of dollars a year, living comfortably. And so Marxism would look at poverty and the social problem is based on the inequality of pay, and how those that are in power and have more, and those that aren't have less. And that is a result of poverty. That is a result of homelessness. There's a lot more. There's a lot of social problems that are linked to poverty, and we're going to talk about that through the semester. The other theory that falls under conflict theory is non-Marxism. This is more about power, the institutions and groups that have more power. Marxism is about money. Non-Marxism is more about power. Those that have the power to make the decisions that this is a social problem and to make it into where people will conform. For example, in 1984, the government decided that the legal drinking age should be 21. Many states were opposed to that. Many people were opposed to that. That was not the general consensus. Many people did not see that as a social problem, the social condition of drinking. If you were 18, you were an adult. The government used its power and told the states, if you did not comply with raising the drinking age to 21, you will lose all funding for roads. Road construction happens all the time. You look at it. Everywhere you drive, you're going to run into road construction and repairing and rebuilding and interstates. It helps with traffic. And so states were forced. This is expensive. They didn't have the money for this. They needed the federal government's money. And so they complied. Although they did not agree that it was a social problem at the time, those that were in power made that decision, and the states were forced. They were sanctioned if not. Symbolic interaction is the third sociological perspective. It's what's called a micro level. Conflict and functionalism, structural functionalism, looks at the broad, global, big picture. Symbolic interactionalism looks at the smaller. It's the interactions and meanings between people in smaller groups. In microsociology, a social condition must be defined as a social problem before it becomes a social problem. We have to define it. We've agreed on it. There's interpretation. There's meaning to it. Under the symbolic interactionalism is what's called the labeling theory. Here's an example. If teenagers think that drinking is cool and fun, and you kind of go with the media on the commercials, that it brings groups together, it's something friends do, they're not going to see it as a social problem. They will continue to do it. Smoking vapes is the same thing. All of a sudden, you have middle schoolers smoking vapes. And teenagers and high schoolers. It's cool. It's the new thing. The Juuls, you have flavors, which is why the government has come in. But when teenagers do not see this, they continue to think it's cool. It's the thing to do. They're not going to see it as a social problem. It won't be defined that. Homelessness is another example. Some people look at it as a social problem, others don't. We have the meaning. When you ask people, why is somebody homeless? The meaning, the interpretation many people have is that they're lazy. They're drug addicts. They don't want to work. This is a personal choice. And in reality, if you look at it, that's not the case. But as long as many people have that definition, have that meaning related to that under symbolic interactionalism, it's not going to be looked at as a social problem. So you can't just say, a group doesn't come along and say, okay, seatbelts, it's a social problem, let's enforce everybody to wear a seatbelt. I'm going to go back to that example. Sociology is all about research, statistics, backing it up. And so the final element of a social problem is looking at a social condition and coming up with a sociological question. For example, seatbelts. Not wearing seatbelts creates more deaths and car accidents. Wearing seatbelts will save lives. I can say that back in the 60s and 70s, but people would just kind of look at me. That's not a social problem. So there has to be some research. You have methods of data collection. So the first thing you have to do is come up with a sociological question. Seatbelts. Seatbelts will save lives. More lives in car accidents. You have variables. And then you have research data collection. There's methods. The first method is experiments. I don't think many of you have seen, but many years ago there were commercials and there were experiments. They put dummies in cars and ran them into a wall and would see how the body would fly, go into the windshield, go out into the steering wheel, and then they put them in seatbelts. They also use these commercials to help convince people to wear seatbelts and what could happen. Another data method is surveys. You could ask different questions and have a survey. I'm sure all of you have been exposed to surveys, whether online, in person. Tell us how we did. There's many different surveys and ways to use those. Field research. Going out, maybe going on to accident scenes, looking at the scenes. What would have happened had the person been wearing seatbelts? What would have happened? Would it have changed the outcome? And so that is one of the data collections. And then the fourth one is secondary data research. This is going through all police reports, looking at the data, looking at the statistics that has been done before. You will do a lot of secondary data research. When you go and research, you're looking up what everybody else has put out there. You will use a great deal of the secondary research throughout your papers, and your forums, hopefully, and your writing assignments. So that's just kind of an overview of Chapter 1. We'll be doing video lectures. They'll be up earlier than this, than the start of the week. These are just a resource for you. I hope that, remember that they're not professional, but I hope that they are useful for you throughout the semester.